Here are 9 ways to lower latency in your Quad Cortex presets and better connect with your guitar tone. So the first way today is getting your lanes right. Now, in my previous video on the channel, I actually covered 8 different lane routes that you can use as templates moving forward for your presets, but we didn't really go into the latency side of things. So I'm going to quickly show you now some implications to lane routes on your latency. So up on screen here, we have my Gordon Friedman preset, which I've condensed down to a single row in this particular example. And we've got the effects loop send 1 set to go back into my interface. And we'll be doing a ping test using the I/O capabilities in Logic. And as you can see here, using one row, we've got 154 samples, which is 3.21 milliseconds. However, if we add a splitter into the second row, which is the same core in the Quad Cortex, and we set the level A2 off, and we're just focusing on the signal that is going into the effects send back into the audio interface. When we ping it now, you can see that we go to 165 samples, which is a very small increase from 3.21 milliseconds to 3.44 milliseconds. So we're not seeing that much difference in latency by introducing a second row. However, if we move the effects send 1 down to row 3 and extend the first row into row 3 using the second core in the Quad Cortex, the ping changes from 165 samples to now 218 samples, which is 4.54 milliseconds. So we are introducing a lot more latency by using the third row instead of keeping our signal chain on a single core in the Quad Cortex. Now, if we want to leverage a vocal lane as a separate lane, that's not an issue if we run it on the different core in row 3, as the additional latency mainly comes from blending your signal from one core into the other core in the Quad Cortex. So ideally, keep your signal into one core using rows 1 and 2, rather than pushing it into row 3 and 4. Not all amps are made equal. Now in the Quad Cortex, we have a lot of selection of different amplifiers to use. However, not all the amplifiers are equal in terms of CPU usage and latency implications. Before this video, I went through every single amplifier, every single drive pedal, and many other blocks as well to test individual latency differences. Now, typically most blocks don't add much latency actually. However, some amplifiers in particular did increase my latency even while disabled on the preset. Now, the worst offenders for me were the following amplifiers: the Brit 900 Clean, the D-Cell Hisbert Channel 2, the D-Cell Hisbert Channel 3, the PV505 Lead, and the PV505 Rhythm. Now, these all added around the same amount of latency, around 32 samples, which is 2/3 of a millisecond. And so just be aware that if you're using these particular amps, it's more likely that you're going to experience latency with your preset compared to other amp models in the Quad Cortex. Now, I'm not quite sure the reason why these particular amp models are creating more latency than others. It could be that there are background tasks going on, so when you engage the amplifier, it doesn't have any additional processing that it needs to do at the point of switching it on. However, I can't confirm that of course, but the same thing does apply with drive pedals as well. Speaking of which, not all drive pedals are made equal. So just like with amplifiers, there are some drive pedals which I found added latency in my preset compared to others. Before the video, when I was editing my Gordon Friedman preset, I was trying to find a great boost pedal that sounded good but also didn't add more latency to the preset. And I found that a number of those did. So what I've done is I've compiled a list of the boost pedals that I have used and which don't add any additional latency to at least to the preset that I use. And these drive pedals are the Green 808, the Obsessive Drive, the Chief BD2, the SLO 100 OD1 from the plugin, the SLO 100 OD2 from the plugin, the 14 Grind from the Nameless plugin, and the 14 Hex Drive also from the Nameless plugin. So if you're concerned about latency, it might be worth trying these boost pedals first before you go to the other pedal models in the Quad Cortex. An important footnote to this is that potentially what these pedals were doing was taking my CPU usage up to a certain threshold, and then over that threshold, then it kicked in the next level of latency in the preset. You may find this occur with other pedals such as modulation, which are more CPU intensive. So you may find that adding this pedal in your particular preset is fine if you're low enough in a certain threshold, but these pedals are less likely to push you over the next threshold compared to the other drive pedals in the Quad Cortex. Avoid effects loops unless you need them. Now, effects loops are really useful to have in the Quad Cortex if you want to use external pedals and separate effects into certain areas of your chain. However, effects loops do add latency into your chain, so you need to be aware of that. So as an example, here in this preset, when we just ping without an effects loop, we get 165 samples. Then when we add in an effects loop, like so, and the effects loop on the back of the Quad Cortex is just connected with a single patch cable, what we find is we get the sample rate now at 275 samples, which is an increase of 2.29 milliseconds, which is pretty substantial if you're getting to certain levels of latency already. Now, if you're using an effects loop, it's probably because you need to use it, but just be mindful of the fact that there is analog and digital conversions going on multiple times, so it's going to add that latency into your preset. Enable CPU monitor and see your worst offenders. So the Quad Cortex allows you to see the CPU usage at any time by just toggling that option on. And this can be quite useful to see where your worst offenders are in terms of block types. So here in Cortex Control, I'm just going to go down to the CPU at the bottom and click that. And now we can see exactly the usage of each block with the color that's filled up from the bottom. And as you can see here, that the amp is definitely the most CPU intensive, followed by the wham pedal and the overdrive, funny enough. Then the reverb we have in place, which is the plate lush. Then followed by the compressor at the top, which I believe is the dual compressor, as well as the IR loader and the delay as well. Now the EQ doesn't add much load at all to your chain that I found, and some compressors as well, like the Optocomp Mono, don't add much latency at all in terms of CPU usage. But definitely it's worth toggling this on at one point in your preset creations and just see if you have anything which you potentially could replace with a lower CPU loading version. For example, I found the Chief CS3 compressor and the dual compressor to be the most intensive for impacting latency compared to other compressors, but really it's going to be things like amplifiers which is going to have the biggest effect. Now, if you'd like to have a different amplifier for all your different gain stages, you're going to create a preset with a lot of latency. Use blend to save additional lanes. Now, going back to the very first point we talked about lanes, another block which is really useful is the blend, the transparent blend and the plugin blend. So what we can do is, for example, if we have a wet, dry, wet rig, we can set that up so that we don't need to use the second lane to split the signal, but instead just triggering a blend block from the signal in the first row, leaving the second row open to a vocal lane or another instrument. So if we go over to the alternate approach template I've set up, which looks like this, you can see that we've removed the row 2 and instead we've got a transparent blend block at the start of the lanes 3 and 4, set to 100% blend and triggered off the chorus there if we had it active. You could also just trigger it from the input as well. But through this method, we're still going to get the signal going into it without even specifying an input at the far left, and frees up rows 2 for another instrument, as I said, or just to lower the latency of the preset slightly itself. FX loop send. Now, if you're like me and want to get latency as low as possible in your presets, but also use something like a power amp and cab in addition to front of house outputs, then this trick is going to be really useful for you, so you don't have to add an extra lane just for your dedicated power amplifier signal path. So here you can see the lane configuration that I set up for my new optimized Gordon Freeman public preset, which I will make available, by the way, in the cloud if you'd like a more optimized version for latency. And as you can see here, I have added a effects loop send 1 block just before the cab on the top row. And this will allow me to send the signal out before the cabinet into the power amp without needing an additional lane to do anything with. And the great thing here is because we've kept our signal all within the first 2 rows and within 1 core, we're going to minimize latency a lot without needing to go to row 3 and then keep row 4 for the vocal lane that I used. So this has really helped me lower the latency of the previous preset I was using, and even just a couple of milliseconds difference, I really do feel it on my fingers. Use real drive pedals before the input. So in a previous video on the channel, I compared real drive pedals, using them before the input of the Quad Cortex, in the effects loop, as well as doing captures of them. One of the tests that I covered was about latency, and using the drive pedals before the input of the quad Cortex was the best in terms of latency and actually tone in my opinion. But if you want to get the best of both worlds in terms of latency reduction and overall tone, I think it's hard to beat using drive pedals in front of the quad Cortex. Now, of course, the compromise there is portability, compactness, overall weight of your rig, but depending on what your requirements are and how much overall latency you want to reduce, this could be a good option for you. Block placements. Now, one thing that surprised me when I was doing all these latency tests was block placement makes a big difference as well. And you may find that moving a block to a particular row affects the overall latency without adjusting it in your overall signal path. For example, moving one block from the end of a row to the start of the next row. So for example here, the digital flanger on the second row, if we do a ping test on this, we get 165 samples. But if we move that same block just up to the higher row, then we find that the overall latency, even with all the blocks disabled and no extra blocks being added to the preset, changes to 197 samples, which is 2/3 of a millisecond increase in latency. Now, again, I'm not exactly sure why at the technical level this is occurring, but it could be, as I alluded to earlier, around maybe background processes. But I definitely would recommend in your own presets to experiment with block placement to see if you can find a more optimal way to manage latency without affecting, of course, the overall signal chain that you want to use. Okay, so I hope you found this video really useful and got some good takeaways from it to apply to your own presets. I will make the Gordon Freeman Lite preset that I mentioned earlier also publicly available if you liked the previous preset and would like the latency optimized version of it. I'd love to hear your tips down below as well about how you manage latency in your own presets and any other advice which I didn't cover in this video as well to lower the latency and better connect with your guitar tone. If you did find this video useful, please make sure to leave a like and a subscribe if you're not subscribed already, and I'll see you in the next video.